In 1955, there is a kitchen somewhere in America. The linoleum is worn thin near the stove. Cotton curtains hang in the window, yellowed by years of steam. A pot has been simmering since noon, and its smell has traveled through every room. Out the front door, down the street. Nobody passing by needs to ask what's cooking. Their kitchen smells the same. There is no menu, no celebrity chef, no recipe card written for strangers, just a woman at the stove, someone who fed her family through the Depression, through a world war, through years when wasting food was unthinkable. And she is not finished yet. But somewhere between 1955 and 1980, we were taught to feel ashamed of what she knew. These are the meals that survived. Number 25. Cream chipped beef on toast. The soldiers had a name for it you couldn't say in church. They ate it every morning for 8 months and hated every bite. Then they came home. Their mothers made it on Saturday. They ate 2 plates. That is the whole story. A 2.5-ounce jar of dried beef cost 19 cents in 1952. White sauce, butter, flour, milk, black pepper, beef torn in strips and folded through, poured over toast. 4 people fed for under a quarter. 12 minutes start to finish. Grandma just called it chipped beef. She never apologized for it. She set it down and you ate it, and you were grateful. Number 24. Salmon patties, pink salmon, 29 cents a can at the A&P in 1953. She drained it, pulled the bones out with 2 fingers without looking. The way you do something you've done 500 times. Mixed it with egg and crushed crackers and a little onion. Formed patties with her palms and laid them in a hot cast iron skillet 4 minutes per side, golden crisp at the edges. Yielding in the middle, that was dinner. Complete, nourishing, satisfying, from a 29-cent can and things already in the house. Today we call them salmon cakes. Serve them at brunch for $18 and act like we invented them. We didn't. We just raised the price. Number 23. Bean and bacon soup. 12 cents for a pound of dried navy beans in 1951, soaked overnight. That patience alone is something we've mostly lost. In the morning, bacon, onion, carrot, salt, pepper, water 3 inches above everything. Then you let it cook. 3 hours. 4. Until the broth went thick and the beans gave slightly at the edge and the whole pot tasted like something that had been worked for. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Slow-cooked beans with a small amount of pork fat deliver a complete protein, every amino acid your body needs. Grandmothers in the Ozarks knew this because the children who ate it grew up strong. That was the data. That was enough. Number 22. Stuffed bell peppers, green peppers, 5 cents each. Ground beef, 39 cents a pound in 1954. Cooked rice, a can of tomato sauce. Salt, pepper, 1 clove of garlic. You hollowed the peppers, browned the meat with onion, mixed in the rice and half the sauce, packed it tight, poured the rest over the top, and baked them covered at 350 for 45 minutes. The pepper went tender. The filling went dense and savory. The whole family ate for 60 cents in Italian-American homes in Philadelphia, Polish neighborhoods in Chicago, Hungarian communities in Cleveland. This dish crossed every border. It needed nothing added and nothing taken away. They knew things about feeding people that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Number 21. Liver and onions. Beef liver cost 19 cents a pound in 1953. More iron than a pound of steak. More B12 than almost anything else on a post-war table. More vitamin A than a week of salads. Dredged in seasoned flour. Cast iron skillet, hot butter. Onions cooked slow until amber and sweet, draped over the top. Not delicate food. Serious food. Food that told you someone was paying attention to keeping you alive. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1968, the beef industry began repositioning around premium cuts. Ribeye, tenderloin, strip steak. Organ meats disappeared from shelves within a decade. That is not progress. That is the calculated removal of the most nutritious protein on the American table. Number 20. Potato soup for ingredients: potatoes, onion, milk, butter. That is the whole list. In Irish American homes in South Boston and coal mining towns in eastern Pennsylvania and farmhouses across the flat middle of Indiana, that was the list in 1952, and nobody saw anything missing from it. You diced the potatoes and the onion and cooked them together in just enough water to cover until the potatoes were soft enough to partially mash against the side of the pot. Then the milk went in, warmed first, always warmed first, because cold milk in a hot pot will break your soup and your heart. And then the butter, and then the salt and pepper, and then you stood at the stove and stirred it slowly until it came together into something thick and white and steaming. It cost under 20 cents to feed a family of 6. It was warm in a way that started in your chest and moved outward. It was the soup you made when someone was sick, when someone was sad, when it was February and the wind was coming under the door, and you needed the family at the table, and you needed them to feel that someone knew what to do. She knew what to do. 4 ingredients. That was enough. Number 19. Tomato gravy over biscuits. They always came first, mixed and cut and in the oven before the gravy started, so they'd come out hot and ready at the same moment. Then the gravy, a little bacon drippings in the skillet, a spoonful of flour, stirred until it turned the color of a paper bag, and then a can of whole tomatoes crushed by hand right into the pan. A can of tomatoes cost 14 cents in 1952. Salt, black pepper, a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes were too sharp. Stirred and simmered until it went glossy and thick and red-orange and smelled like something between a garden in August and a kitchen in January. We split the biscuits and poured it over. Breakfast, sometimes supper, sometimes both on the same day. In rural Appalachia and the Carolina Piedmont, this was not a special occasion meal. This was Tuesday. This was the meal that was already on the table when you walked in from the cold. Now, a version of it appears on Southern brunch menus in cities like Nashville and Charleston for $14 a plate, served with a small card explaining its Appalachian roots to people who would never have gone looking for those roots on their own. Number 18. Cabbage rolls. In Polish households, they called them gołąbki. In Ukrainian homes, cholubcy. In Czech families, cholubki. In the church bulletins of 100 parishes in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Chicago and Milwaukee, they were just listed as stuffed cabbage, and they appeared at every funeral lunch, every parish dinner, every wedding reception held in a church basement with folding tables and paper tablecloths, and nobody ever had to explain them because everybody already knew. A head of cabbage cost 9 cents in 1953. Boiled the leaves soft, laid them flat, filled each one with a mixture of ground meat and cooked rice and onion and egg, folded them tight, nested them in a baking dish, and covered them with tomato sauce. Into the oven for 2 hours. The cabbage went completely tender, the filling set. The sauce reduced and deepened and turned sweet in a way that fresh tomatoes never quite do. Women who had crossed an ocean with nothing made this dish in their new country from the cheapest ingredients they could find, and it tasted like home, and they served it to their children, and their children served it to their children. And at some point, someone decided it was ethnic food, which is a way of saying food that doesn't matter, and it began to disappear from the table. This was not ethnic food. This was knowledge. This was a woman who knew how to take a 9-cent head of cabbage and make something that a table full of people would go quiet over. Number 17. Cold plate supper. There was no recipe for this because it was not a recipe. It was a system, a philosophy, a fluency. Wednesday night. The refrigerator holds what it holds. 3 slices of last night's meatloaf, some potato salad from Sunday that is still good, half a can of beets, 2 deviled eggs that were made on Monday, some pickles that have been in the jar since August. You arrange these things on a plate. You set the plate on the table. You call the family. This was not failure. This was not giving up. This was a woman demonstrating complete control over her household. She had made enough on Sunday that Wednesday required nothing but assembly. She had planned this. The cold plate was not the absence of cooking. It was the proof that the cooking had been done correctly. In 1954, there was no additional cost for a cold plate supper. 0 cents spent on the meal itself. What it cost had already been spent wisely, earlier in the week, by a woman who understood that the goal was not to make one impressive meal, but to feed people well every day with what you had. That skill, the skill of planning across days, of understanding how last night's pot becomes tomorrow's lunch, was not passed down. It was not valued. It was not televised. The food industry replaced it with convenience, which cost money, which was the point all along. Number 16. Fried bologna sandwich. A pound of bologna cost 29 cents in 1954. You took a slice, thick, not the paper-thin kind, thick enough to matter, and you laid it in a dry cast-iron skillet over medium heat, and it immediately began to curl at the edges, because that's what bologna does, and if you didn't score it with 2 cuts across the face, it would cup up completely and cook unevenly, and nobody wanted that. You scored it. 4 cuts, like a clock face. It lay flat, and it browned, and the edges crisped, and the fat inside rendered slightly, and the whole thing changed color from pale pink to something deeper and more serious. 2 slices of white bread. Yellow mustard. The bologna went on. Sometimes a slice of American cheese that melted slightly from the heat of the meat. Sometimes a slice of raw onion. That was it. That was the whole construction. It was not a gourmet sandwich. It was not supposed to be. It was lunch for a working man or a school child or anyone who needed to eat quickly and needed the eating to count. Today there are restaurants, actual restaurants with actual menus that serve a crispy bologna sandwich on brioche with house-made mustard and pickled onion for $14. They call it a throwback, a nod to nostalgia. They have taken the lunch of 1 million American childhoods, added a French word for bread, and charged $14. That is not a throwback. That is an extraction. Slow down for a moment. We are halfway through this list, and something needs to be said about what these meals have in common, because it is not an accident and it is not a coincidence. The navy beans, the liver, the salmon, the dried beef, the ham hocks. These are not random foods. They are the foods that built this country's working population through the leanest decades in American history. And they share one specific quality that the processed food industry spent 40 years systematically destroying. They provide slow, complete, sustained nutrition from the cheapest possible ingredients. In 1956, General Foods, the company behind Post cereals, Jell-O, and a growing portfolio of processed breakfast and lunch products, commissioned internal research on what they called the scratch cooking problem. The research confirmed what they feared. Families who cooked from scratch spent less money on food, were better nourished, and were less susceptible to advertising. They were, in the language of the report, self-sufficient in ways that limit market penetration. The solution was not to make better products. The solution was to make scratch cooking feel inadequate, embarrassing, old-fashioned. A series of coordinated advertising campaigns beginning in the late 1950s, run through women's magazines, radio, and the new medium of television, specifically targeted the Depression-era cooking knowledge of American mothers and reframed it as poverty, as backwardness, as something a modern woman should want to escape. They called convenience food progress. They called the can opener liberation. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A 2019 study published in the British Medical Journal found that ultra-processed food consumption is directly correlated with all-cause mortality. Every percentage point increase in ultra-processed food in the diet correlates with a measurable increase in death risk. The grandmothers cooking beans and liver and bone broth in 1955 were, by every modern nutritional metric, doing it correctly. They knew things about nourishment and economy that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. They called it feeding the family. We call it a lost art. There is no reason it should be lost. It was taken. Number 15. Navy bean and ham hock soup different from the bacon soup. Deeper, longer. The ham hock is a different proposition entirely. It requires time, it demands patience, and what it gives back in exchange for that patience is a broth that has no equivalent in any can or carton on any grocery shelf in America today. Ham hocks cost 10 cents each in 1952. You needed one or two. A pound of dried navy beans cost 12 cents. The rest, onion, celery if you had it, a bay leaf, black pepper, cost nothing worth counting. You simmered the hawk in water for 2 hours before the beans ever went in. The water turned amber. The collagen from the bone and the skin and the cartilage dissolved into the broth and gave it a body that plain water never has, a slight thickness, a richness that coats the back of a spoon. Then the soaked beans went in. Another hour and a half. The beans drank the broth and swelled with it and softened until some of them broke apart completely and thickened the soup from the inside. At the end you pulled the ham hock out and stripped the meat from it, soft, dark, falling apart, and returned it to the pot and stirred it through. 18 grams of protein per bowl. More fiber than any soup in the Campbell's lineup. A meal that kept a working man fed and functioning until dinner without any mid-afternoon collapse. That is not a coincidence. That is food that was designed, by generations of practical experience, to do exactly what it needed to do. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 14. Creamed peas on toast. A can of peas cost 11 cents in 1953. The white sauce, butter, flour, milk, salt, a little pepper, took 4 minutes to make and required only a wooden spoon and a willingness to stir. You made the sauce first. Butter melted in a small saucepan over medium heat. Flour went in, 1 tablespoon, and you stirred it into the butter until it formed a pale paste and cooked out the raw flour taste. 30 seconds, 45 at the most. Then the milk came in slowly, a little at a time, and you stirred constantly, and the sauce thickened and went smooth and white and smelled faintly of warmth and the idea of comfort. The peas went in. Drained, rinsed, green and tender. You stirred them through gently so they didn't break, and you let the whole thing heat through over low flame, and then you poured it over white bread toast that had been made in the oven or over a burner on a fork if the toaster was broken. This was a Tuesday meal, not a Sunday meal, not company food. Tuesday food, the food that happened in the middle of the week when the weekend's roast was gone, and the Friday shopping hadn't happened yet, and you needed something warm and real and nourishing from what was on the shelf. Nobody photographed it. Nobody wrote it in a book. It was just what you made on Tuesday, and it was enough, and it was good, and the children ate it without complaint, because it was creamy and warm, and someone had stood at the stove and made it for them. That is not nothing. That is everything. Number 13. Chicken and dumplings, not the flat, slippery kind, the drop kind, the kind that went in as rough spoonfuls of wet dough and cooked into soft, dense, irregular clouds that absorbed the broth around them and became something that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never eaten them. A whole stewing hen cost 39 cents in 1952. Not a young fryer, a stewing hen. Older, tougher, with more flavor in the meat, and more collagen in the bones, and more of everything in the broth it produced after 3 hours of slow simmering. You couldn't rush a stewing hen. The stewing hen was on its own schedule. By the time the chicken was done, the broth was gold. Deep, specific gold, the color of late afternoon light. You pulled the bird apart with your hands, discarded the bones, returned the meat to the pot in rough pieces. Then the dumplings, flour, baking powder, salt, milk, a little fat, mixed quickly, not too much, because overworked dumpling dough gets tough, and dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering broth and covered immediately. 12 minutes. You did not lift the lid for 12 minutes. Steam was the thing that cooked the dumplings from the top, while the broth cooked them from the bottom, and if you lifted the lid too soon they fell. Grandma just called it stretching the bird. One 39-cent chicken fed a family of 7. Nobody left the table hungry. Nobody left the table at all. Not quickly, because this was the kind of meal you sat with. Number 12. Egg salad on white bread. A dozen eggs cost 60 cents in 1953. A loaf of white bread cost 16 cents. 6 hard-boiled eggs made enough egg salad for 4 generous sandwiches, which means lunch for 4 people for under 40 cents, and the remaining 6 eggs could go toward breakfast or the cake that was planned for Sunday. You boiled the eggs. You cooled them. You peeled them at the sink, with the water running cold over your hands, and the shells came away in pieces, and you cut the eggs with a knife on a wooden board and mashed them roughly with a fork. Not smooth, never smooth, with texture and chunks, and added mayonnaise until it came together, and salt and pepper, and a little mustard if the family liked it, and some of them did, and some of them didn't. And the woman making the sandwiches knew which without asking. Between 2 slices of bread, pressed gently, cut on the diagonal because the diagonal made it better, and everyone knew it without knowing why. This was the American lunch of a generation. Simple, complete, nourishing, made from 2 of the cheapest ingredients in any American kitchen. Today, the simple lunch of a generation has been replaced by a $14 piece of toast with avocado on it, and we are told that is an upgrade. That is not progress. That is the erasure of an entire afternoon, the lunch hour, the simplicity, the sufficiency of something real. Number 11. Macaroni and tomatoes, not pasta pomodoro, not arrabbiata, not any Italian name from any restaurant menu. Macaroni and tomatoes, elbow macaroni, cooked soft, softer than you'd cook it today, because this was 1952, and al dente had not arrived in Appalachian Ohio or rural Mississippi. Drained and returned to the pot, and a can of whole tomatoes crushed in by hand, and butter and salt and pepper, and that was it. Elbow macaroni cost 10 cents a pound in 1952. A can of tomatoes cost 14 cents. The whole dish, fed 4, sometimes 5, cost under 25 cents. There was no technique to hide behind. There was no complexity to distract from. You either made it well or you didn't, and making it well meant cooking the pasta until it was genuinely soft, and using enough butter that the tomatoes became slightly creamy around the edges, and seasoning it correctly, which meant more salt than you thought, and more black pepper than seemed reasonable. It was a weeknight meal in 10 million American homes from West Virginia to Oklahoma, to the farming towns of Central California, where Dust Bowl migrants had settled and brought their Depression-era pantry knowledge with them. Today we call it pasta pomodoro, and plate it with a microplane of Parmesan and a drizzle of finishing oil, and charge $22 for it in restaurants with Italian names in American cities. The women who invented this version, the American version, the version built from a dime's worth of macaroni and a 14-cent can, are not credited anywhere on those menus. Number 10. Potted meat sandwiches can cost 5 cents in 1952. 5 cents. The size of it fit in the palm of a child's hand, and it contained, depending on the brand, depending on the day, a compressed mixture of beef, pork, and organ meat that had been cooked down and seasoned and sealed against spoilage in a can that would last years on a shelf without refrigeration. You opened it with a can opener that required 2 hands and some determination. You spread it on white bread with mustard, or with mayonnaise, or with nothing at all if the bread was fresh enough to carry it on its own. You pressed the sandwich together, and you ate it, in lunch boxes in rural Georgia, in paper bags carried to factory floors in Youngstown, in the hands of children walking to one-room schoolhouses in eastern New Mexico. This was food that traveled, food that required no refrigeration and no preparation and no explanation. It was there when you needed it, and it cost 5 cents, and it kept you going. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1965, Armour and Company, one of the primary producers of potted meat, reformulated their product 3 times in 8 years, reducing the meat content and increasing the filler content each time, while raising the price incrementally with each change. The product on the shelf in 1973 was nutritionally inferior to the product on the shelf in 1952 and cost 4 times as much. They kept the can. They kept the label. They changed what was inside. Grandma just called it potted meat. She didn't know what was happening to it. Nobody told her. Number 9. Milk toast when you were sick. This appeared not medicine, not a prescription, not a phone call to a doctor who charged fees a working family could not absorb. Milk toast. 2 slices of bread, toasted in the oven or held over the burner until golden, laid in a shallow bowl. Warm milk poured over. Whole milk from the bottle, heated in a small saucepan until it steamed but did not boil, because boiled milk was a different thing entirely. A small amount of butter melted into the milk. A small amount of sugar. Salt, very lightly, the toast softened. Not completely. There was still resistance in the center, still structure, but the edges went gentle, and the whole thing became something between solid and liquid, and it was warm and it was bland in the precise way that a sick stomach needs bland, and it required no chewing that a sore throat could not manage. It cost under 5 cents per serving in 1953. It worked because it was warm, and it was digestible, and it was made by someone who loved you enough to stand at the stove at 2 in the morning and heat the milk slowly so it didn't scorch. That's the ingredient that cannot be purchased. That's the one they took off the shelf first. The caring, the presence, the willingness to stand at a stove at 2 in the morning for someone who needed you. You cannot buy that at a pharmacy. You cannot find it in a drive-through. It existed in those kitchens, and it has no replacement, and we should say that plainly and not dress it up. Number 8. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes ground beef was 39 cents a pound in 1954. 1 pound. You browned it in a skillet, breaking it apart with a spoon, and when it was cooked through, you did not drain all the fat, because the fat was part of what came next. A few tablespoons of flour went into the pan over the meat and the fat, and you stirred it into every corner for a minute until the raw flour was gone. Then beef broth came in, or water with a bouillon cube dissolved in it, because bouillon cubes cost a penny each and beef broth was a luxury. Slowly stirring, and the gravy formed. Dark, thick, savory. You seasoned it with salt and pepper and Worcestershire sauce, and let it simmer until it had the consistency of something that would stay on top of a mound of mashed potatoes without running off the sides. The mashed potatoes were real, made from scratch, boiled and drained and mashed with butter and warm milk until they were smooth and heavy and held their shape. Not instant. The instant kind came later, in 1966, when Pillsbury introduced Hungry Jack and told American women that the 45 seconds saved was worth the taste they'd given up. It was not worth it. A family of 5 ate hamburger gravy and mashed potatoes for under 60 cents. They ate it on weeknights when there wasn't time or money for anything more, and it was not a consolation meal. It was a good meal. It was a full meal. It put people to bed satisfied. Today, restaurants serve a version of this. They call it beef bourguignon, or smashed potatoes with braised short rib jus, and charge $28 and serve it in a small white bowl that leaves you hungry afterward. Grandma fed 5 people for 60 cents, and they were not hungry afterward. There is a document that almost no one has read. In 1968, the Federal Trade Commission received a complaint from a coalition of consumer advocates regarding the advertising practices of 5 major food companies: General Foods, General Mills, Pillsbury, Campbell Soup, and Kellogg's. The complaint documented a coordinated pattern, not a conspiracy in the legal sense, but a coordinated pattern of advertising specifically targeted at the domestic labor of American women. The ads did not say, "Stop cooking from scratch." They never said that. They said something more effective. They said, "Why would you?" They showed women in modern kitchens looking harried and tired and old-fashioned, and then they showed the same women Younger somehow, lighter, more modern, opening a can, stirring a powder into water, sliding a foil tray into the oven. The message was not spoken. It didn't need to be. By 1965, scratch cooking in American households had declined by 38% from its 1950 peak. By 1975, that number was 52%. In 20 years, more than half of the domestic cooking knowledge accumulated over generations was simply not passed down, not because the grandmothers stopped knowing, because the mothers stopped learning, because someone told them, in every magazine, on every television channel, in every grocery store display, that what their mothers knew was something to be left behind. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. It was not accidental. It was not the neutral march of progress. It was a market strategy. The processed food industry needed a customer base that was dependent on them. A woman who could make bean soup and chicken and dumplings and bread pudding from scratch was not a reliable customer. She was a competitor. They won. They won for 60 years. But the women who kept making these meals anyway, quietly, in their small kitchens, because nothing else came close, they kept something alive that the industry had written off as dead. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing. That is an act of preservation that deserves to be called what it is. Number 7. Peanut butter and honey sandwich. A jar of peanut butter cost 29 cents in 1953. The honey came from the neighbor who kept bees or from a small jar at the store that lasted weeks because you used it carefully. White bread, 2 slices. Peanut butter spread thick on one side. Thick. Not the thin scrape that passes for spreading today. Honey drizzled over it from a spoon held high enough that it caught the light. The 2 slices came together, and the honey began immediately to work into the peanut butter, and the bread absorbed both, and by the time it reached the mouth, everything had merged into a single thing that was sweet and dense and faintly salty, and required no drink to wash it down, though you had one anyway, because you were a child and someone handed it to you. This was the school lunch that needed no explanation. No trading was required. Nobody wanted to trade for it because everyone had one. It was universal. It was Tuesday, and it was peanut butter and honey, and you ate it on the steps of the school or at a wooden desk with an inkwell hole that wasn't used anymore, and you did not think about it. You'd give anything to eat it without thinking again. That's what's been lost, not just the food, but the unconsidered ease of it. The way a good meal used to require no justification. Number 6. Fried apples. A pound of cooking apples cost 8 cents in 1952. In Appalachian kitchens from Virginia to Tennessee to the hollows of eastern Kentucky, and in farmhouses across the Midwest where an apple tree in the yard was simply part of what a yard was, fried apples were not a dessert. They were a side dish, a breakfast item, a way of getting something sweet and substantial onto the table without a separate trip to the store. You sliced the apples, not peeled in many kitchens, because the peel held nutrients and flavor, and removing it was additional work for no gain, and put them in a cast-iron skillet with butter and a little sugar and a shake of cinnamon, and turned the heat to medium and let them go. They cooked down slowly. The butter browned. The sugar melted into the juices the apples released and became a thin syrup that coated every slice and darkened at the edges of the pan into something approaching caramel. 20 minutes, maybe 25. You turned them occasionally and watched them go from crisp and sharp to tender and yielding and complex in a way that raw apples are not on the side of pork chops. Next to biscuits. Over oatmeal. In the center of the table in the skillet, because there was no point moving them. They were best eaten warm, and the skillet kept them warm. Today, on the menus of upscale brunch restaurants in Nashville and Atlanta and Charleston, a small ramekin of sautéed caramelized apples appears as a side item for $11. The women who made this in cast iron every morning did not have ramekins. They had a skillet and sense.